He was 7 years old when his father carried him through the massive stone gates of the Temple of Amun at Karnak, and the last thing he remembered of his childhood was his mother's face disappearing into the crowd behind him. His name was Waset, and before he became a servant of the gods, he was simply a boy who loved chasing ibis birds along the Nile and listening to his grandmother tell stories about the stars. The year was approximately 1250 BCE, during the reign of Ramesses II, and Egypt was at the height of its power, its temples the richest and most secretive institutions in the ancient world. Waset's father had sold him to the priesthood in exchange for the forgiveness of debts, a common transaction in ancient Egypt where children were commodities and temples were always hungry for new servants. The priests who received him did not ask his name or inquire about his family or show any interest in the person he had been before walking through those gates. They shaved his head immediately, the razor scraping his scalp while he cried for a mother who was already walking home without looking back, her debt erased by his body's labor. The hair that fell to the stone floor had been touched by his grandmother's fingers that very morning, and now it was swept away like garbage by servants who did not make eye contact. He was given a new name that he would learn to answer to, a temple name that erased the identity his parents had chosen and replaced it with a designation that marked him as property. The temple complex at Karnak was larger than most cities, a labyrinth of courtyards and sanctuaries and storage, chambers where thousands of people lived and worked in service to gods they would never see. Waset was assigned to the lowest tier of temple servants, children who performed the tasks too menial for adult priests, but too sacred for ordinary slaves to be trusted with. His first duty was carrying water from the sacred lake to purification chambers, heavy vessels that strained his small arms and left bruises that no one acknowledged or treated. He worked from before sunrise until after sunset, sleeping in dormitories with dozens of other children who had been similarly surrendered by families too poor or too indebted to keep them. No one spoke of their former lives because speaking of the outside world was forbidden, and children who violated this rule were punished in ways that older children described in whispers. The punishment was not physical violence, which would damage temple property, but something more psychologically devastating: isolation in the house of darkness, a windowless chamber where time ceased to have meaning. Children emerged from that chamber, changed in ways that could not be articulated, their eyes holding a vacancy that never completely filled again, their voices quieter, their questions silenced permanently. Waset learned quickly to never ask questions, to never mention his mother's name, to never look directly at senior priests who walked past as if children were invisible obstacles to step around. The rituals of purification that he participated in were endless and demanding, requiring him to wash his body 4 times daily in the sacred lake, regardless of weather or season. The priests insisted this washing was a privilege, a preparation for serving the god. But Waset noticed that senior priests had heated water brought to private chambers while children shivered in pride-on darkness. His education began in his 2nd year, not reading and writing but memorization of prayers so long and complex that children who failed to recite them perfectly faced the house of darkness. The prayers had to be spoken with exact pronunciation and precise rhythm, because the priests taught that even a single mispronounced syllable could offend the god and bring disaster upon all Egypt. This theological terrorism kept children in constant anxiety, believing that their small errors might cause floods or famines or plagues, carrying guilt far beyond what their years should hold. Waset became excellent at memorization because failure was not an option, and he advanced through the temple hierarchy faster than most children who arrived in his cohort. By age 12, he was permitted to enter the outer sanctuaries, spaces that ordinary Egyptians never saw, where the rituals became stranger and the secrets became darker and the isolation became complete. The priests who governed these spaces had not left the temple complex in decades, their skin pale from perpetual shadow, their social skills atrophied from lives spent entirely among people bound by identical rules. They spoke to Kamwaset only in formal phrases prescribed by ritual, never acknowledging him as a person, never asking what he thought or felt about anything he witnessed or performed. He learned that the god statue was awakened each morning with specific songs, dressed in specific garments, offered specific foods that were later eaten by priests who claimed to receive divine leftovers. The food offering system was the temple's greatest secret and its greatest hypocrisy. Elaborate sacrifices made to the god were actually the primary food source for thousands of temple residents. Common Egyptians believed their offerings literally fed the gods, never knowing that priests consumed every morsel once the ritual presentation was complete and the sanctuary doors were closed. Kamwaset understood this deception by age 14 and felt something crack inside him, some fundamental trust in the system that had taken him from his family and promised him spiritual elevation. But he could not speak of this disillusionment to anyone because the surveillance within the temple was absolute, and doubters were identified and disappeared with efficiency that suggested long practice. The forbidden rituals that history tried to hide were not exotic ceremonies, but the ordinary operations of psychological control that maintained priestly power across centuries and dynasties. Children were broken and remade into instruments of institutional continuity, their individual identities sacrificed to create interchangeable servants who would never question what they were told. Kamwaset watched other boys from his cohort wash out of the system, return to their families as damaged goods, or simply vanished into temple labor pools where they worked until death. He survived by becoming exactly what the temple wanted: obedient, skilled, and curious about anything beyond his prescribed duties, a perfect vessel for ritual knowledge that asked nothing about meaning. By age 20, he had advanced to the rank of Wab priest, permitted to enter the inner sanctuary and participate in the daily awakening ceremony that common Egyptians believed was performed by demigods. The reality was exhausted young men stumbling through memorized actions before sunrise, their devotion long since replaced by routine, their faith corroded by daily exposure to institutional hypocrisy. Kamwaset still performed perfectly because performance was survival, but inside he had become hollow. The boy who chased birds along the Nile, now a distant memory that hurt to recall. His mother had died 3 years earlier, and he learned this information only because a new child arrived from his village and mentioned it casually, not knowing the connection. He was not permitted to mourn publicly or to visit her grave or to perform the burial rites that Egyptian religion considered essential for peaceful afterlife. She had died thinking of a son she had surrendered, and that son had not been there to close her eyes or speak her name to the gods who would judge her heart. This knowledge lived inside Kamwaset like a stone, something he carried through every ritual and every prayer and every sunrise ceremony where he pretended to commune with divine powers. The betrayal that marked the center of his story came not from enemies, but from the institution he had served faithfully for nearly 15 years, proving that loyalty meant nothing to systems that consumed people. A new high priest arrived from Thebes, a political appointee with connections to the royal court, and he brought orders to reform the temple's hierarchy and eliminate redundant positions. Kamwaset discovered that his name was on a list of priests to be returned to common status, a euphemism for expulsion that would strip him of everything he had sacrificed childhood to earn. The priests he had served alongside for years did not protest his removal because protesting meant risking their own positions, and the temple had taught them that self-preservation was the only virtue. He was called before a committee of senior priests who explained that his service had been appreciated, but that the god had revealed through signs that his presence was no longer required. The signs they cited were invented, manufactured evidence designed to provide theological justification for what was actually a political purge benefiting priests with better connections to the new administration. Kamwaset listened to them explain why the gods wanted him gone, and he understood finally that everything he had believed, everything he had sacrificed, everything he had lost had been for nothing. He was given 3 days to prepare for departure, during which other priests avoided him as if expulsion were contagious, as if decades of shared service meant nothing once he was marked for removal. The children he had helped train looked through him as if he had already disappeared, because the temple had taught them that attachment to individuals was weakness and institutions were eternal. On his final night, Kamwaset walked through the temple complex he had known for most of his life, touching stones he had helped clean, passing doorways he had guarded, remembering the boy who had arrived crying. The sacred lake where he had shivered through countless prayed-on purifications reflected the stars his grandmother had once named for him, stars he had not looked at properly in 15 years. He realized he did not know how to live outside these walls, did not know how ordinary people spoke or worked or loved, did not know who he was without the rituals that had structured every hour. The temple had taken a 7-year-old boy and produced a 32-year-old man who was utterly unprepared for existence in the world the temple had taught him to despise as profane and inferior. He left at sunrise, walking through gates he had not passed since childhood, carrying nothing because everything he had used belonged to the temple and personal possessions had never been permitted. The world outside was louder and brighter and more chaotic than he remembered, and people looked at his shaved head and pale skin with a mixture of reverence and pity that he found unbearable. He walked toward his home village even though he knew no one there would remember him, and the house where he had been born had long since passed to strangers. The journey took 3 days. And during those days he spoke to no one because he had forgotten how to make conversation that was not prescribed by ritual formulas. He arrived in a village that had changed beyond recognition, where children chased ibis birds along the same stretch of Nile where he had once played, where life had continued without him. His mother's grave was unmarked, because his family had been too poor to afford proper burial monuments, and he knelt beside the approximate location and tried to remember prayers that might help her spirit. But all he could remember were the temple prayers, the ones designed to glorify gods who had abandoned him, and those words tasted like ash in his mouth. He stayed in the village for several months, working as a laborer because his ritual knowledge had no value in the ordinary economy, and his body had never learned practical skills. The villagers treated him with uncomfortable respect, still believing he had served the gods, not understanding that his service had been to men who used gods as instruments of control. Kamwaset never married because he did not know how to form intimate connections with people who had not been shaped by the same institutional trauma that defined his existence. He never spoke of what he had experienced inside the temple, because the words did not exist in ordinary language, and because speaking ill of the gods still terrified him despite everything. The forbidden rituals were not dramatic ceremonies, but the daily processes of isolation and surveillance and psychological manipulation that transformed children into servants and servants into hollow men. History tried to hide these practices not through conspiracy, but through the simple accumulation of propaganda produced by the very institutions that benefited from maintaining the mythology of sacred priesthood. The texts that survive from ancient Egypt were written by priests or for priests, presenting temple life as an endless cycle of pure devotion and divine communion. They do not mention the children sold by desperate parents, the psychological abuse that passed for spiritual training, the systematic destruction of individual identity in service to institutional continuity. They do not describe men like Kamwaset, who gave everything they had and received nothing but exile when they were no longer politically useful. The temples presented themselves as houses of the gods, but they were actually mechanisms for concentrating wealth and power in the hands of priestly castes who understood that religion was the most effective tool of social control. Common Egyptians labored to provide offerings they believed fed the gods, never knowing that priests ate every meal and grew fat on faith that was systematically manipulated for material benefit. The rituals were designed to be mysterious because mystery created dependency, and dependency created power, and power was what the priests actually worshipped behind their public devotion to Iman. Kamwaset died in his village at approximately age 50, poor and alone, his body buried without the elaborate rites he had once performed for strangers in the temple. No monument recorded his name, and no text preserved his story, because people who are used up by institutions rarely leave traces that those institutions would choose to maintain. But he was human before he was priest, and he remained human after, carrying wounds that never healed and memories that never stopped hurting. The forbidden rituals of ancient Egyptian temples were not exotic secrets, but the ordinary cruelties of systems that treated people as resources to be exploited and discarded. History tried to hide this reality because history was written by the exploiters, and their version of events was designed to justify their power rather than acknowledge their victims. Tonight, if you visit Karnak and walk through those massive stone gates, you walk the same path that thousands of children walked over thousands of years, entering a world they would never be permitted to leave intact. The tourists who marvel at the hieroglyphics and the colossal statues do not think about the human cost inscribed in every stone, the labor of the forgotten, the faith of the deceived. They see the grandeur and miss the machinery, the beautiful surfaces and the ugly mechanisms, the eternal monuments and the temporary people who built them and served them and were consumed by them. Kamwaset's story is not unique but representative, one thread in a tapestry of institutional exploitation that spans every civilization and every religion and every system that claims divine authority for human arrangements. The forbidden rituals were never really forbidden at all. They were standard operating procedure, hidden not through secrecy but through normalization, invisible because everyone accepted them as natural. What history tried to hide was the humanity of the victims, reducing them to servants of the gods when they were actually servants of men who called themselves servants of the gods. Kamwaset deserved better than he received, and so did every child who walked through those gates and never walked out the same person. Their names are lost, but their suffering was real, and acknowledging that suffering is the least we can offer them across the millennia that separate their world from ours. The temples have fallen, the priests have crumbled to dust, the gods have fallen silent. But the pattern remains, repeating wherever power claims divine sanction for human cruelty. And until we recognize that pattern, we will continue to hide the same truths that ancient Egypt tried to hide.